All right, so I think it's probably time to get started. Belinda Evans is here now, so let's give it up for Belinda Evans, because without her, we wouldn't have this nice space or the yummy food, which is totally not the reason you're all here and not my talk. All right, so quick word on the situation here. We have a series of 5 talks this year, and if you come to all these talks and sign in, you get a certificate at the end saying you've basically completed the Scholar of Medical History program here at WSOM. And if you are particularly interested in it, you can actually elect to write a short paper on a topic of your choice and submit that to me to become a quote-unquote distinguished scholar of the history of medicine. So everybody feel free to ooh and ah at that prospect. I heard the oohs. There it is, okay. So we've been doing this for several years now. We actually started out, this lecture was a 1-hour session that was part of the mandatory curriculum, and it was switched around a little bit. And in the process of giving it, I really grew to love medical history. And I give these talks for the same reason I give lectures in anatomy. It's a topic I love talking about because it's so inherently interesting. When you hear medical history, a lot of people think that it sounds boring. And after reviewing it, I don't know how anyone on earth could make medical history boring. It's so amazing and horrendous, and we're going to be seeing so many wonderful and terrible things, and wonderful things created by terrible people. The stories alone are just fantastic. A quick word on it is this is going to be very focused on the history of Western medicine from the ancient Egyptians all the way up to the current day. And it's not because I have anything against Eastern medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, native medicine. I just don't know enough about it to give a good talk on it. So maybe in a few years that will be something I can actually supplement with. So we'll address that very obliquely, but it's an omission just basically because there's only so much time. And I want to play to the area I actually know something about. As with a lecture, if you guys have questions or comments during, I really do encourage them. It's more fun that this be a conversation than just me yapping at you, but I'm fairly good at that, so I will go ahead, but please do feel free to interrupt. Today's talk is going to be going into ancient history up until roughly the era of the Renaissance. We're going to basically set a stage with this talk where we can then take other topics from that era up to the common or modern times. So basically, today is ancient history to the Renaissance. Next talk is going to be talking about how people conceptualized disease throughout history and how that changed into our modern notion of what disease actually is. The third talk will be very similar, but it'll be looking at treatments and how treatments changed as a response to people's understanding of disease. The fourth talk is 2 hours long, and it's the history of surgery. As an anatomist, obviously that's the one I was drawn to, and it's got the best, most horrifying stories. So sue me, I like 2 hours for that one. And then the fifth talk is going back and looking at medical history and looking at the missed opportunities. Things that were missed in terms of ways to treat people, but also the people that were deliberately excluded from the story of Western medicine and what contributions they could have made and what contributions people did make once they were actually allowed to participate in the process. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first evidence we have for any kind of medical intervention is trepanation, actually cutting a hole in someone's skull. Now, this still happens today. Anybody know why we trepanate someone's skull in contemporary times? Why we do that now? The acoustics are clearly built to go that way. So if anybody said something, say it nice and loud. To relieve pressure, yeah. So you've got hematomas, you might have encephalitis. So there's a good reason you might need to open a skull. But in ancient times, what do you think the skulls were opened for? Why would someone want to open up a skull in a medical? To get rid of evil spirits. Yeah, that's usually considered to be the reason people might have done this. Maybe someone was acting erratically, they had some sort of an issue, there was a neurologic problem, and how do you relieve that spirit? You tried to make a hole to let it out. And that underscores one of the first things that is very important is medicine and spirituality in ancient times and up until modern times are very intimately connected. One of the really interesting things about Western medicine is there is a very clear break between medical practice and religious practice, which didn't always hold true in times prior to that. Now, this year, I was able to actually get something fun. So my two teaching assistants here, Dashiell and Archer Ward, have a little something they're going to pass around. So guys, go ahead and pass the prop to one of the other tables and just pass this around as you guys go. This is not a trepanated skull. It is a plastic cast of a trepanated skull. So it's cast from a real example. But the thing to notice about it, just like the one on the right, is that this skull healed. The person survived that procedure. So these procedures were done without anesthesia, without contemporary knowledge of surgical activity, yet they could be done in a way that people would survive. How about the one on the left? Did they survive that operation? I see shaking heads. Tell me why. All those incisions are still very sharp. There's no evidence of healing. Whereas on the right, the borders have gotten a little more smooth. That person survived the procedure and went thereafter. Now, who had this game as a kid, or even now? I'm 100% convinced this is a joke, but if anyone ever finds this game, I really want a copy. So please, please let me know if you come across Trepanation, the game. So trepanation actually took place all over the world. It's mostly associated with archaeological finds in South America and Central America, but it took place in a lot of different cultures. And the Peruvians actually had a deliberate way of performing this and trying to diagnose how diseases were spreading as a result. Now, I mentioned medical practice and spiritual practice were very intimately tied together because there wasn't seen to be a clear distinction between health of the body and health of the spirit. And so they actually did sacrifices of guinea pigs, held them over the affected areas, and then looked at their organs to try to divine what sort of problem might be there and what sort of treatment might be affected. And animal sacrifice leading to diagnosis was not only something that was happening in Central and South America, it was very markedly known in ancient Mesopotamia. So in Assyria and Babylon, they actually had models of livers, and that's what's shown on the left here, that showed where different lesions would be that would lead you to diagnose different problems. So if you had a tumor on a sheep's liver here or somewhere else, it would lead you to think that the diagnosis was one thing or another. So at this point, spirituality and medicine were still intimately connected because it was felt that diseases happened, one, because of a curse that was placed on a family, or because a demon had caused someone to get sick because they'd offended the demon or come across it. Yet treatment began to be a little more focused on intervening against the symptoms rather than just the spiritual cause. So there were actually treatments that were there, performed by priests, but also by secular healers who would give herbs, minerals, things like that to try to ameliorate the symptoms that the person was suffering from. Now, ancient Mesopotamia, we know a lot about it because they left a lot of written records and clay tablets. And the funniest thing, I think, is most of these clay tablets that are the most ancient are mostly receipts for business expenses. So it's not insightful poetry or, lists of kings. I think the oldest name known to man is from one of these tablets, and it's basically someone complaining about getting cheap quality copper from the guy. Other things that were kept track of, though, were laws. And the famous king in this era, where that was Hammurabi. He laid down a set of laws, and among other things, it actually dictated how physicians were to be compensated and punished. So, there we go. First part, if a doctor has treated a free man with a metal knife for a wound, has cured the man, opened his tumor with a metal knife and cured him, he shall receive 10 shekels of silver. Yay! If you've treated a free man with a metal knife for a severe wound, caused him to die, or destroyed the man's eye, his hand shall be cut off. So contemporary malpractice doesn't seem quite so bad in comparison to what could have been the way back then. But essentially, we're seeing that people were taking an interest in the quality of medical practice that was going on in their kingdoms. Now, a bit further south and to the west, we have Egypt. And the really fascinating thing about Egypt is the Egyptians had the process of mummification where they would preserve the bodies of the priestly and high-class citizens. They would remove all of the organs except for the heart, put them into what are called canopic jars, put those back into the body, and basically fix the body, removing the brain as a process. They thought the brain was just buffer they didn't think it was there for anything important, so they removed it. And in the process, they learned a bit about practical anatomy, but none of that information made it to the healers. The people who embalmed and the people who acted as healers and physicians were completely separate. So all of this had nothing to do with the Egyptian practice of medicine. It's just fascinating that you could have millennia of a culture where there was very little cross-pollination. The Egyptian medical practice, however, was fairly sophisticated. They had a lot of written texts devoted to drugs, minerals, things that they could prepare to treat people. It's some of the earliest pharmacopoeia, or listing of medicines, that are out there. And essentially, the medical theory that the Egyptians developed was based on the idea of flux. And if you had bad food or something nasty got into your body, it would travel through your blood and set up a wound or a tumor somewhere. So when tumors appeared, or wounds appeared, or pus appeared, it was felt that it had traveled through bad blood to get there. And to treat people, you had to purge that bad substance from the body. So they would bleed people, give them enemas, purgatives, make them throw up, and massage. I like how massage is in there as an afterthought to all the other nasty ones. But because they wrote it down on papyrus, which is a type of reed-based paper, and that stays fairly intact in the hot climate of Egypt and dry climate, we actually have records and can see how they treated people. So this is, I think, the Smith papyrus. Yeah, the Edwin Smith papyrus that was discovered and is still available to be studied. So another aspect that blended the spiritual with the healing aspects of Egyptian life was what was called incubating in a temple. So the Egyptian god Imhotep, who was maybe possibly based on a real person, maybe not, but this was a healing god, and people would go to his temples, and the priests there would look after them. These temples were often in mountainous areas with a lot of free, nice air. They were well tended to, they were clean, and people would go to these temples, basically rest there until they had what was called a therapeutic dream, which told them how to treat their ailment and how to go forth and proceed. One quick thing about these temples is they were also a home to a great many sacred snakes. Now, think about snakes for a second, if you care to. What does a snake do that's kind of symbolic of the act of healing, of getting better? They shed their skins, so it's an act of renewal. They were seen as symbolic that way. What do snakes do that makes them great for keeping down nasty diseases? They eat vermin. Yeah, so they eat rodents. They keep diseases down. So these temples, maybe not for the reason we'd expect, but were actually decent places to rehabilitate. If you were going to get better, you were being cared for in a clean, hygienic environment, and chances were good if you were going to get better, you did, and left. This process was taken from Egypt by Greek mercenaries who were fighting on behalf of the pharaoh and brought back to Greece. And in Greece, instead of Imhotep, we have Asclepius. And just like Imhotep, Asclepius is thought to have possibly been a real person who then had kind of a cult of worship built up around him. The mythological Asclepius was a human who got so good at healing that Zeus killed him because he was depriving Hades of all of his subjects in the afterworld, or the underworld rather. So he was then deified, so he was a human who became a god in the mythological sense, may have been a real historical person, but that's unclear. But essentially the same process took place in temples of Asclepius. And if you notice something, this is the caduceus. Caduceus is the rod of Mercury. Mercury is the god of commercial activity, thieves, businessmen. I don't know, they put those two together, make whatever commentary you wish as a result. Travel, and the rod of the caduceus has two snakes around a staff, whereas the rod of Asclepius, the healing rod, has one snake wound around it. Hey, looky there. Hey, all right. Now, some other legends of Asclepius was that he was taught by Chiron, and any Percy Jackson fans in the room will actually know that name. Chiron was actually, mythologically, a centaur who was a healer and a doctor. And he taught Asclepius so well that, again, Asclepius was able to heal people and had to be actually killed to stop him from keeping mortals from becoming immortal. And can you guys actually read the little Reddit thing there? If anyone can't, I'll say it out loud, otherwise I'll let you do it. I hear giggles. I won't narrate. Okay. So that's the list of characters associated with healing in ancient Greek times, and the connection between spiritual practice and medicine is still very strong. And in addition, healing was recognized as having multiple aspects. So you actually had multiple sons and daughters of Asclepius who were responsible for different aspects of health. Two of the big standouts would be Hygeia, and if you think that sounds a lot like hygiene, you're absolutely right. She was the goddess of preventative, maintenance of health, public welfare, keeping disease down, keeping things hygienic and clean. And then we have Panacea, the goddess of universal cure, and that's the curative aspect of medicine, trying to intercede when things have already gone bad. So we have preventative and curative medicine already present in theory as separate entities back in ancient Greek times. Now, this is about medical history, but it's almost impossible to talk about later medical theory in the Islamic societies, the medieval European societies, and Renaissance societies without talking a little bit about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, because they were so influential on so many things. Hands up, who's heard of these people before? Okay, if you haven't, buckle up. This is the most rapid tour, underserving them tremendously. But essentially, Socrates was one of the founding philosophers in the Greek tradition, asked his students to question everything, and stood by his beliefs as an example of how to live a life rather than how to just make money off being a good argumentative person who could go to court and win cases. His student Plato saw the material world as a reflection of a far more perfect world. And that far more perfect world exists in idealized forms, and the material that our world is made out of could only hold those forms roughly. It was never perfect. Interestingly, his student Aristotle had a very opposite view. He looked at the real world and said that that's where we need to base our observations and our theories, and understanding the real world, grounding our observations in the real world, is how we can actually arrive at more ideal understandings. So again, we've got a dichotomous kind of yes-no way of approaching how reality is formed, and that's going to have a massive impact on medieval and Renaissance thought, including the practice of medicine. Now, one thing that terminally annoys me that the Greeks gave us for our detriment is the Greeks and later the Romans had a really harsh distinction between manual labor and intellectual labor. And they saw manual labor as being low, common, unproductive, uninteresting, and that if you were really high class and you had the capacity, you should just spend your time thinking big thoughts all the time and not get your hands dirty. Now, the problem with that is manual labor is not mindless work. Skilled labor, working with your hands, is a really excellent way to learn how the world works. But that separation of manual labor from intellectual activity really stuck with Western society for a long time. And even to this day still does. Like, just quick show of hands, who had a high school or college where they kind of discouraged people from doing either auto shop or calculus? Like, anybody have a school where mixing and mingling sort of things like that was discouraged? Anybody? Maybe not too many? That's good. Because the idea that you can't learn by doing is pretty ridiculous. And that's something we have the ancient Greeks to thank for. And just real fun, this is the School of Athens by Raphael. And right in the center we've got Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. Plato looking at the ideal that's above, Aristotle looking at things that are down below and saying, no, this is where we should focus. And just for kicks, Raphael painted himself as Aristotle, and right there, Leonardo da Vinci as Plato, because they were he was influential on him. So the first person that we can really say took Greek medicine in a different direction was Hippocrates, as in the Hippocratic Oath that people sometimes take in MD schools at the end of their training. He was a physician on the island of Kos, and he really didn't think that you could blame disease on spiritual factors, generational curses, things like that, and that you could actually intercede to help your patients. And if you were attentive, you watched them, you observed them, and you had good remedies available, you could actually help them out. Now, his medical theory by our contemporary standards, is nonsense. It means it's not even remotely effective. But the fact that he cared about the patients, put a lot of energy into observing them, tracking how diseases progress, and coming up with effective cures, even though those were based on a kind of outlandish theory, they still worked. And because of that, the Hippocratic physicians were kind of gained status as being effective healers. People wanted to work with them and wanted to support them, and they became the predominant type of physician thereafter. Now, his theory is going to come up over and over again in these talks. It was based on what are called the four humors. You've got blood in the body, which corresponds to air as an element. And my kids will raise their hand in a second. Who liked Avatar, Last Airbender? Okay, this is going to sound very similar to you. So we've got the four elements. We've got blood corresponding to air, and if you have a lot of blood, you're sanguine, you're happy, you're good, happy to go. Yellow bile was corresponding to fire, and if you were bilious, you had too much of that yellow bile, it made you angry and quick to action. If you had too much black bile, this other humor, corresponded to earth and mud, and you had melos chole. You were melancholy, you were sad and kind of slothful. And lastly, phlegm corresponded to water, and if you're phlegmatic, it's a word that means kind of sluggish, non-active. Think of Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, and you've got a pretty good idea about what phlegmatic is like. One other fun fact, the Greeks thought that phlegm was actually your brain leaking out your nose, and it just kind of replenished itself over time. So how do these four humors manifest? So they're kind of worked on opposite axes. So essentially, you have hot and cold on one side, you've got dry and wet on the other. So which humor is going to be corresponding to these? Well, blood and air, it's hot and wet, so that's where that corresponded. Think of air as humid air. I think that's what they were thinking of with that correlation. What's dry and hot? The yellow bile, that fiery element. And then black bile was considered to be dry and cold, and no surprise, phlegm was considered to be cold and wet. Now, you'd think humoral theory is long in our past, but it still hangs on every so often. What did your mother, grandmother, or other matronly figure in your life tell you to put on if you went outside in the cold, rainy air? What's going to happen if you don't wear your coat and your boots and your hat when you go out in the cold, rainy, windy air? You're going to catch a cold. That's pure humoral theory, that you're going to have phlegm coming out your nose, you're going to get a cold because you went out into the cold, wet air. So it still hangs on in sort of interesting ways. Oh, and here's just some illustrations of people who are phlegmatic, bilious, melancholic, and so on. So what did the Hippocratics do? Well, once they figured out what humor they felt was out of balance, they would intercede with very similar things to the Egyptians. Herbs, minerals, massage, but also bleeding, purging, giving people different diets to follow, actually doing sweating, trying to sweat out different humors. They actually did some manipulations too. There's actually a very primitive OMM table there on the right that the Hippocratics would sometimes use to try to help people out. But the big one was bleeding. Apparently people being overly sanguine happened a lot, so they would release blood to get people back. Now, we know that bleeding people is probably non-effective, possibly going to hurt you in the process. But if you take a few pints from somebody, do they complain? Or do they just kind of pass out? Yeah, so medical practice was just like, okay, it's a success. They're not yelling at me anymore. That'll be $30. So Egyptian culture led eventually, after it was conquered by the Romans, to influence Roman culture. But prior to that, in the area of Alexander the Great, we had Alexandria in Egypt, home of the Great Library, and there were two anatomists working there who made several important discoveries and modifications to the Hippocratic theory. Now, one was called Herophilus. He figured out that the pulse and the heartbeat were connected. Now, it kind of seems obvious to us now, but this was the first time someone had actually put those two things together. We know of some of his works by descriptions of other people, but we don't have any of them. Other people described him, we don't really know. A contemporary of his was Eratosthenes, and he developed what was called pneumatic theory. It was a modification of humoral theory. And in this theory, blood is in the veins, Arteries carry kind of this airy thing called vital spirit, and that's turned into what's called animal spirit by the ventricles in the brain, and then that goes to our nerves and actually causes our muscles to move. So if you think about this spirit in the nerves, it'd be like blowing up a balloon. So you pump that spirit into the muscle through the nerves, the muscle swells, and what happens? Movement. So that was the theory. Now, you guys have taken a look at several nerves by now. Have you seen any of them that were hollow? Yeah, I don't get it either, but that was the theory that was propounded. And that theory was taken up by our next big name, this guy named Galen. Galen of Pergamum, which is in kind of the western area of Turkey now, but was part of ancient Greece back in those days. He decided that the Hippocratic teachings had become way too confusing. Too many people had added different stuff, contradictory stuff, and he wanted to make one definitive version of the Hippocratic teachings and make that as perfect as possible. So he did a lot of research on anatomy. He did a lot of dissection. And he looked at how the muscles worked, and he connected the fact that nerves are what make muscles move. If you cut a nerve, that muscle can no longer move. He moved to Rome and actually became a very high-status physician. He was actually a physician to the emperor, and he found a lot of interesting things. He did a lot of experiments, but they were all based on humoral and pneumatic theory. And he tried to come up with a way that these could all come together. Now, by our contemporary accounts, there's a lot of problems with his findings, but his experimental approach would have led to some really good progressive activity in scientific medicine. But Galen basically shot us all in the foot on that one, because Galen had, think of the most monstrous ego you can on the most stereotypical orthopedic surgeon out there, and that person, just pick the most stereotypical one. I know some awesome orthos, but just pick that stereotype and then triple it, and you've probably got Galen's ego. Galen basically said, hey, I've done all the hard work. I figured it out. No one needs to do any more experiments. Just know what I've written down, and you're good. You'll be the best doctor out there because there's nothing left to find. And he was taken very seriously. He became the definitive medical expert. Now, just to give you some idea about what a problem that is, when you abandon that experimental approach and focus only on memorizing what was presented, you get some wacky stuff. So here is a real quick rundown of the pneumatic theory elaborated by Galen. So you eat. Chyle from the food, C-H-Y-L-E, goes to the liver and is transformed into blood. And blood has natural spirit from the liver, and then it just kind of washes out through the veins. And that's really all that was ever described. There's not really any pumping going on. It just kind of washes out, floods over the organs, supplies them by just diffusion. And the veins are being moved a little bit by the heart. He knew that the heart was moving blood a bit, but he thought that it was coming from the liver, and the heart just kind of helped encourage, push it along in a little bit of an escalator-like fashion. So the blood, impurities could be removed by going to the lungs, but majority of what happened in the lungs was that air was brought back through the pulmonary arteries, and he thought the pulmonary arteries were full of blood, the left ventricle was full of blood, and that the blood in the right ventricle mixed with the air in the left ventricle through tiny holes that allowed them to mingle and create a new type of pneuma. So that pneuma was called vital spirit, and the vital spirit was pumped up to the brain, and this network of vessels at the base of the brain transformed it into, I kid you not, psychic pneuma. So psychic pneuma was what was pumped through hollow veins to make the muscles move. So that corresponds exactly to what we taught you in foundations, right? Okay, but 600 years ago, yeah, that would have been your foundations course, would be basically this right here. So why was Galen unquestioned for so long? Well, for one, he was very confident. Never underestimate the power of a confident person, even if they're talking complete garbage. They can really convince people. He saw the body as the creation of a demigod that was called the demiurge. It wasn't an all-powerful god. It was more in line with the Greek and Roman ideas of God. But the demiurge was like a workman, and he was working from perfect plans with imperfect material. So it's a very Platonic approach that you're trying to take a perfect concept but apply it with imperfect material. Now, this idea of the body as an imperfect creation of a creator was very comfortable for the monotheistic religions that came into the Mediterranean area thereafter. His writings were very widely distributed in Arabic, Greek, Latin, other languages as well, so he was translated extensively. And he based his findings on experiment, even though people, including himself, only wanted to draw attention to the results. So Galenic theory, this idea of medicine, was roughly unchanged for 1,300 years. Now, anybody in here a history minor? Anybody here takes, oh, we got one, good job. Anybody here who's taken more than 1 or 2 history classes in college? Who has a passing interest in history? Okay, so on this list, I'm just going to run down really fast some of the stuff that happened while medical theory stayed more or less the same. We'll start off. The Roman Empire. Anglo-Saxons invade Britain. The Muslim conquest of Spain. Constantine goes to Constantinople, removes the Roman capital from Rome. The Western Empire falls. Charlemagne is crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. Vikings raid all throughout Europe, including the Mediterranean. The Magna Carta stops the British kings from doing whatever they want all the time. The Crusades, lots of them, are launched from Europe, and the Roman Empire falls in the East. The New World discovered, and then Spain is covered by Ferdinand and Isabella, and the Protestant Reformation sweeps through Northern Europe, and then we get the Renaissance. So, all that stuff happened. Meanwhile, physicians, surgeons, barbers, other people basically work under the same paradigm that whole time. Think about how much medicine has changed in the last 100 years. And now think about 1,300 years of just pure, stifling, just non-experiment. Now, when Galen was actually kind of thrown down and surpassed, it was because other people started doing experiments and looking at how results were arrived at rather than just focusing on those results. Now, after Rome fell, Western literature, medicine, especially mathematics and astronomy, were preserved in Baghdad and Damascus, in the Muslim empires that grew up in those areas under the various caliphates that were in those cities. And there were a lot of scribes working to translate the Greek and Latin documents into Arabic, and that later served as a source for those being retranslated into Latin and other languages. Now, in the Islamic empires, very little research on anatomy and surgery was done because it was felt that cutting into the body was not acceptable. It was prohibited. So despite the many scientific advances in other areas, surgery kind of lagged behind, although there were some developments. One was that the Muslim surgeons were really good at removing cataracts. Now, cataracts are when your lens gets very milky and you can't see through it. And this was not considered to be cutting into the body because they didn't cut into the eye. They used a blunt probe, and swallow your food now, and they would just kind of shove the lens back into the eye out of the way. Now, it's not as good as having a lens to focus vision, but now instead of nothing, you can see shapes. You can see movement. So it was better than just having that cloudy lens blocking everything. Now, some of the big names at this time, we had Rhazes, also known as Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi. So Razi was the shortened version for European readers, and there were a lot of European readers, especially in monasteries and other places, that were looking for these medical texts. So he was living in Baghdad. He was working with the humoral theory from Galen. The Muslim physicians and surgeons were very interested. And I say surgeons even though they weren't cutting into people because there was surgery happening that we'll talk about in a second. But what the Muslim physicians were really good at was categorizing and distinguishing different diseases from each other. Just take a second and think of everything that causes a fever. Is everything that causes a fever the same disease? But if you didn't know any better, how would you go about classifying them, subdividing them, thinking about which symptoms belong with one disease but not another? That's something that they put a lot of time and energy into, was categorizing diseases. Alchemy was also a huge aspect of Muslim science at the time, and it became chemistry. A lot of people give alchemy a bad name. Alchemy was a lot of garbage, but there was a lot of good stuff there that became chemistry. And if you know anything about Arabic, al just means the. Al-chemi, the chemi, or the chemistry. That's where it came from. So essentially, they worked on ways of extracting different substances, being able to actually isolate things from botanicals, and we'll talk more about that in the third lecture. Rhazes was actually a very kind of free-thinking person for the time. He publicly doubted Galen, which was right underneath blasphemy. So Galen was not religious text, but it was really almost on par with that in terms of societal authority. And he was actually blinded after someone, it's unclear who, took offense to one of his anti-Galen lectures and actually had him publicly beaten. Now, next up we have in Cairo, working in the Caliphate in Cairo, was Al-Hazan, or Ibn al-Haytham, and he worked on the eye. Now, physics and optics were intensively studied in these societies, and that's where the eye comes in, because they were looking at refraction and how the eye actually is able to create an image. Now, the pervasive theory of vision up until this time was called the extremissive theory. And, okay, hands up, fellow nerds. Fellow nerds? Anybody? Nobody's admitting to it? Okay. There we go. Jonah, thank you. I appreciate it. So think of Superman. The extremissive field of vision, idea of vision is you're shooting beams out of your eyes at all times, and then it bounces back like echolocation, your eye records that, and that's how you're able to see things. That was the theory. Al-Hazan, as well as some others, and Ibn al-Naifs, who we'll talk about later, came up with the idea that that was just wrong, and that it wasn't that our eyes were sending out signals, it's that they were receiving signals. And he worked on the anatomy of the eye, how the lens refracts light, much like a glass lens would do, to actually create that vision. And then we have another huge name, Avicenna. Now, Avicenna was very active in a lot of areas, but he wrote a huge canon of medicine, which became the de facto medical textbook for roughly 500 years. He was very devout religiously and believed a lot in what Galen said, but he also didn't really, well, he was a little concerned that his contemporaries thought that he was embracing pagan thought too much, and he tried really hard to put Platonic concepts into a basis that was more aligned with the Muslim faith. And that actually worked to the advantage of Aristotle and Plato later, because making them palatable to a monotheistic religion in that arena made them more palatable later when they were translated for the Christian countries in Europe and the monasteries there. So he wrote a tremendous amount, became very influential, and he was actually living in Spain for quite a long time. Now, he supported and really pushed the miasma theory of disease. And this is another one of those mistakes that largely stuck around because of the authority of the people pushing it. Miasma simply means bad air. And it's the idea that you breathe in bad air and that's what makes you sick. Where does that bad air come from? Hard to say, but it was one of the theories about where disease comes from. Fun fact, what's the disease called that is transmitted to people by mosquitoes that we are dealing with and trying to get better at in a lot of countries? Starts with the letter M. Malaria, literally mal-area, bad air. That's what they thought caused it, and that name stuck around. Oh, other fun fact on the humoral theory, influenza. The full name was actually influenza del freddo, the influence of cold air. So again, it was that theory that the humors were being upset by cold air, and that's why you got the flu. So we lost the de freddo, but we kept the influenza for reasons we don't know. All right, so next up we have Averroes. This is another picture from Raphael's the School of Athens. And he was a judge and physician in Al-Andalus, which was basically modern Spain, that had a large Muslim population in the southern part until the Reconquista in 1492. So he also commented on pagan authorities and tried to bring them together with medicine. But in his case, he wanted to bring Aristotle together with Galen. And as we saw, Plato and Aristotle, despite being a teacher and a student, really had a lot of discrepancies. And there was a lot of argumentation about who was to be believed better. And lastly, we have Ibn al-Nafis. Now, he was in Damascus and then moved to Egypt thereafter. He looked at the eyes, much like Alhazen did, and worked with him on that. And he accurately described pulmonary circulation years before it was rediscovered by William Harvey, which we'll talk about at the end of the lecture. Now, he theorized that there were capillaries in the lungs that allowed arteries and veins to communicate with each other, but this link was lost, and for reasons we'll see in just a moment. So even though he described it earlier, that train of thought was lost, and secondly, it didn't really do much for the humoral theory. Under the prevalent theory at the time, who cares? We care about upsetting and resetting the humors rather than actually worrying about where the blood goes. Now, he had done enough research to realize that Galen was wrong about a lot of things. Galen's anatomy was incorrect, but he knew his Galen very well and kept some of those same errors, such as the ventricles having holes between them that allowed them to mix the blood and supposedly the air in the left ventricle. But what I really like is that he likely did some human dissection and he wanted to explore and investigate. And I love this quote of his: "We shall rely necessarily on verified examinations and straightforward research, disregarding whether our opinions will agree or disagree with those of our predecessors." So at this point in the late 13th century, it really looks like we're primed to have a scientific revolution in these countries. But we didn't. Anybody know why? Well, we can thank Genghis Khan. So the Mongols wash through the Middle East, and Genghis Khan and them, they wipe out Damascus. Now, you guys have heard the phrase, the rivers ran red with blood, right? Well, I'm sure they did that in Damascus as well, in Baghdad, but there are contemporary accounts that say the rivers ran black because of all the ink from all the books that were being just dumped into the river from that area. So it was a huge loss of collected knowledge up to that time. Now, the scholars who lived in those empires were not all Muslim. Some were, but there were also Jews and Christians working in those schools in the House of Wisdom. And these people, when Baghdad and Damascus fell, and later Constantinople, they left for Europe. And thankfully, in Europe, we'll talk a little bit more about medical practice during the Middle Ages and the early Middle Ages, but essentially Europe was kind of a backwater. And it was starting to get better, and it got better because we had universities founded, largely to teach theology, but later law and medicine were added as the three main topics of study. And when these scholars fled Damascus and Baghdad, they brought their works with them, and they found a lot of support in Europe. These universities really wanted these people coming because they were bringing way more accurate translations of Galen, Plato, Aristotle. They were bringing a great deal more knowledge with them that had a lot more. One, they just had more works of these people, and they had better quality translations of them. So these universities taught those three things, but the universities that developed early in places around the Mediterranean, Salerno, Bologna, Paris, Padua, the main thing they did was focus on that medieval obsession with authority. So let's take a look. What's most important in this picture? And the pointer's not working. There we go. Is this guy even looking at his patient? Dude's got a busted arm. Come on, look at the busted arm. What's he looking at instead? The thing with paper? Say it loud. Book, thank you. So yeah, basically, it's all about getting better resources, getting better authoritative resources. It's not about investigation. It's about having more accurate writings from the past masters who it was felt could not be surpassed. That was a very medieval mindset, was that it was about recapturing lost wisdom rather than creating new wisdom. So knowledge of the body especially was very primitive. Now, interestingly, dissection was not prohibited. There was a papal bull that prevented crusaders from boiling the bodies of their dead companions down to the bones to make them easier to transport, and some places interpreted that as a law against dissection. But dissection was explicitly allowed by Pope Sixtus IV so that artists and physicians could have a better knowledge of the human body to heal it and to represent it. But dissection at the time, even though it was happening, was not really much of an experimental science. Basically, Executed criminals could be given over to artists or to physicians to dissect, and that could happen, but this is way before both fixation and refrigeration. So this was generally done in the cold months. The organs were dissected first and the limbs later, because what did the organs do before the limbs? Gotta say it loud. Decompose. I was gonna go with rot, but decompose is a much more classy way of saying it, thank you. So these were done, but basically, the dissections were not there to show what was actually there. They were just basically propaganda tools to show how brilliant Galen was. And so, here's a nice illustration of what actually happened at these. The anatomists who were doing it weren't even necessarily looking for errors because their mindset was, well, Galen's got it all figured out. We just need to reinforce that. So, up at the top, we've got the professor. The professor professes the truth of Galen, reading from a textbook, probably seated, probably not even looking at the dissection that's taking place. Now, down here we have somebody slightly lower status. That guy is the instructor, the ostensor. He gets a pointy stick. He's high enough class, he doesn't actually have to touch the body, but he does point to things to illustrate what the professor's talking about. And last and their hierarchy, least, was a barber or a butcher who actually did the cutting of the body. Someone who probably had no expertise on what the medical side was, but knew how to actually go about cutting the body. So we've got that clear division between the intellectual and the manual. And the professor is not getting his hands dirty. He's letting someone of lower status do that. So these dissections were fruitless in terms of finding new information. And I particularly love this. We try to hit you guys really hard with be professional in lab, and by and large, you do a great job. And I don't want to praise you too much and let you get slacking off, but I do want you to know that sword fights, singing festivals, and dangerous fights would break out in the dissection theaters and things like that. They were basically very tall, conical areas so that people could stand in the risers there and get a view downward at the body. And dissection was kind of almost seen as a punishment for those who were executed. If they were cut up, it was felt they would never be whole when Judgment Day came. So this was seen as an extra, kind of an afterworldly punishment for these people for committing their crimes. So instead of respecting those who donated, there was no donation, it was a punishment. And sometimes they played music, and before I retire, I'd like to take a note from my predecessor here, Fabricius. He would sometimes enter the theater in purple and gold robes with accompanying musical flourishes. So I'm thinking string quartet, maybe in the background. There we go. Now I mentioned that physicians and artists were allowed to dissect, and sometimes that strikes people as a little odd. But art during the late Middle Ages and Renaissance was really undergoing a massive kind of reconfiguration where accuracy and reality were far more prized. And the artists at the time were really working hard to try to make the body appear real in their sculptures and in their paintings. So we've got Leonardo da Vinci with his Vitruvian Man on the left, Michelangelo with his Pieta. I mean, if you just look at the anatomy in these, it's clear these people knew their anatomy. And both Leonardo and Michelangelo did multiple dissections to try to understand the muscles and how they moved, where they were located, how they bunched up, and how they made the body appear. My favorite story about these guys is at 17, Michelangelo became, he wanted to become an artist. His father had wanted him to become a lawyer, and he was really upset that he was becoming an artist. And so he wanted to learn more about the human body, so he went to a convent hospital, and in exchange for carving a crucifix for them, they let him dissect some of the patients who died. And he got caught by his father coming home one night, and his father was like, "What have you been doing?" And instead of telling the truth, he said, "I was out drinking, going to the red light district and hanging out with loose women." So instead of admitting that he was out dissecting, he just said, "I was out partying, Dad, sorry." Now, there's a whole series of papers that people put together, some of them better than others, about how Michelangelo snuck anatomy into his paintings, apart from the musculoskeletal system, apart from the surface anatomy. There's some pretty clear little hints that he put into his paintings to kind of show little aspects of anatomy that were hidden. So for example, we've got that right there. Take a look. There's little things like that hidden in a lot of his paintings, although some people I think have gone a little too far and see every little squiggle as representing some aspect of the medulla oblongata, etc. Now, Leonardo da Vinci is universally known as a great genius, but the more you learn about him, the greater a genius he seems to be. It's like there is no limit to this guy. He did dissection, he made massively accurate anatomical texts, was actually considering making an anatomy atlas with a colleague, but like many things Leonardo da Vinci did, he never saw it through to the end. But he's the first person, as far as we know ever, to draw a cross-section of the human body, drawing cross-sectional anatomy. That skull showing the air sinuses was more accurate than any anatomical illustration had been. The problem was that Leonardo did not publicize these findings. He really wanted to be known as an architect, as someone designing battle fortifications, and also as a painter, but he never really followed through on these. And so by the time these were rediscovered, they'd lost their novelty. They'd been surpassed. But he was the first person to find a lot of errors in Galen and draw accurate descriptions of the human body. So the person who's pretty much credited with the first nail in the coffin of Galenic theory is this guy, the first modern anatomist, Andreas Vesalius. He was born in Brussels, and he went to school in Paris and then later to Padua in Italy. So on his way to a town every day as a child, he lived up on a hill, and then the town was at the bottom. And as he was going into town to Brussels, he would walk through the hanging grounds where the criminals were executed. Now, at that time and in that place, they left the bodies on the rope until they completely decomposed. So he would watch them decompose, see the organs, see the muscles, see the ligaments. He'd even steal some of them and take the bones and ligaments home and investigate how they moved, what they were holding together, and so forth. And so by the time he went to college, he actually knew more anatomy than probably most of the professors because he'd just been looking at real anatomy without any preconceptions for such a long time. He became the chair of anatomy and surgery at Padua at 24 after his graduation. That still hurts me a little bit. At 24, he was already there. But he decided he didn't like the way he'd been trained. He didn't like the professor, the lector, and the ostensor being different people. So he instead did the dissection in front of his students. He brought a mounted skeleton, almost certainly one of the executed criminals from Brussels, that he had mounted and demonstrate what he was doing. So he talked through the anatomy as he cut, and he was willing to show where Galen was wrong. He started compiling a list of things that Galen was wrong about, and these were not minor things. His dissections convinced him that Galen was just wrong about a lot of things. So what was Galen wrong about? In addition to the pneumatic theory I mentioned earlier, the skeletal details and muscle attachments were just wrong. Not completely off, but wrong. Blood has no way of moving between the left and right ventricles. There's no little holes in there. Unless the person has a ventricular septal defect, there's no regular way for that to happen. And humans have no rete mirabile, no network of vessels at the base of the brain. Normally that wouldn't be a big deal, but this is the centerpiece of his entire theory of how things work, and it's not there. If you look for it, you will not find it. So what struck him eventually was that Galen never dissected a human. He dissected various animals, different apes, but he never dissected a human, and that's where a lot of the errors came in that were multiplied when he applied his humoral theory and pneumatic theory to that imperfect understanding. So, great little quote there, Galen was misled by his monkeys. So, Vesalius proved that Galen was wrong about a lot of things, had a lot of public demonstrations to that effect. How do you think that went over with all of his colleagues in the university? Since we don't want to talk tonight, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Yeah, pretty universal, thumbs down. He was reviled for daring to question the authority of Galen, and even if he could show that things were different, his colleagues would say, well, if it's different, it's not because Galen was wrong, it's because people have changed since Galen wrote that. So essentially, he kept on fighting and fighting against this brick wall of opposition, finally got sick of it, burned his papers, and became physician to the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Sounds like a pretty good job, but Charles V had a lot of Galenic physicians. He kind of took anyone's advice. He wasn't really a model patient. And Vesalius got kind of sick for working with him when his son Philip II took over. That's the Spanish Armada king, just for any history buffs in the neighborhood. He said, I'd really like to take a trip to the Holy Land. It was actually thought he was going to try to go back to Padua or Paris and just become a professor again. But he had a shipwreck on a Greek island of, it's called Zakynthos, and that's where he died. Now on Zakynthos, there is a statue in honor of Vesalius. And are you ready to hear the most petty, jealous moment of my life? Ready? For my wife's 40th birthday, she and two of her friends went on a Mediterranean tour, and she has a friend who lives in Italy and was kind of the tour master. So they started in Rome, went to Greece, and then she said, oh, yeah, Anna's taking us to this cute little beach island in Greece. I've never heard of it before. Oh, yeah, what's it called? Zakynthos. I'm like, you picked the one island I would give a knuckle to go to. So I try not to be bitter, but yes, my wife has been to the death place of Vesalius, and here I stand. There we go. So let's take another look at what was good about Vesalius. In addition to accurate descriptions, his atlas actually looked like a real human body. So before Vesalius, everything was very schematized, very schematic, very Galenic. And so this is actually one of the better pictures you can find of a skeleton. This is attributed to kind of an illustration accompanying some of the works of Avicenna. Just before Vesalius, in the late 15th century, we have this, Anatomy of a Pregnant Woman. Now, I defy you to tell me, what is that? That's not a thing. Is it a stomach? And then there's this blind pouch here? I mean, it's clearly not based on an actual human anatomy instruction. It's just basically a very schematized, very idealized version of inaccurate theory. So now let's take a look at the images that were in Andreas Vesalius' book, De Humani Corpora Fabrica. Now, he had a colleague who was a student of Titian's named Stephen von Kalkar, and he made these woodblock prints. Now, let's be real. There are errors in Vesalius. He was not perfect, but he was such a huge step forward in accuracy that if I had to, I could teach you anatomy through this book. I could use these illustrations and teach anatomy still using those. It's not perfect, but neither is any other atlas that we have. So it was a huge step forward in both artistry and accuracy. So I talked about my petty jealous moment. Who wants to hear about my best day? Okay, here we go. Was it the day I got my PhD? Hey, Mom and Dad, hope you're proud. Was it my wedding? Oh, that was awesome. Yay. Was it the birth of these two little dudes right down here? Was that the best day ever? Or was it the day at The Ohio State University where I got to inspect a copy of De Humani Corpora Fabrica? Because my children are here. It was clearly the day you guys were born. Absolutely. But those are the big four. Now, the next big jump forward in terms of medical practice was not a direct result of Vesalius, but it was a result of the same attitude of looking at things, researching things, and being willing to question authority. William Harvey was another student at Padua, but he was an Englishman. He learned anatomy there, and then went back to England and actually became a physician to the king. He was actually a fairly high-status physician. But he also did a lot of experimentation, and being physician to the king allowed him to do a lot of experiments on animals from the king's private gardens. You know, he was able to get executed criminals and do dissections there. And he doubted the authoritative anatomy that had come down to him. Now, he, as far as we know, was not aware of the works of Ibn al-Hafiz. He did not have any knowledge that someone had looked at pulmonary circulation before. So it's believed he figured out that Galenic theory of blood flow was just wrong. Because remember, Galenic theory of blood flow was that the liver produced blood, it washed out over the organs, and that was kind of it. He figured out that if you tied off the pulmonary artery, you could actually interrupt blood flow to the right ventricle, clearly clearly underscoring that Galen was wrong about those things, and that if you allow the fluid to move, the fluid would fill up that chamber. If you blocked it off, it would stop. So he was able to figure out that the lungs were involved in one circuit of blood and that the heart pumped blood through the arteries to the rest of the body. Now, he had no idea about capillaries, but he theorized that they might exist. Now, another thing, people had had veins forever. They've had bloodletting happening forever. And yet, William Harvey was the first person to figure out that the veins allowed blood to flow in one direction only because of the valves that were in them. And this is actually an illustration from his book, De Motu Cordis, on the movement of the heart, and showing that the veins allow one flow direction for blood because it's returning to the heart. Now, he also did the first quantitative experiment in medical history. So when you guys have equations in physiology, you can thank William Harvey or shake your fist at him. Because the thing that he did that really hit home that Galen was wrong about blood flow is that if your body is producing blood and it's just washing over the organs with each heartbeat, your body would have to create roughly 540 pounds of blood every day. Now, first off, how? Secondly, where's it going? Galen never said. So he figured out that there's no way you create that much blood, so there has to be a circuit that keeps it moving, keeps it returning, so you're using the same blood in the process repeatedly. Now, the way he did this was really clever. He actually looked at cold-blooded animals like snakes and lizards and cooled them down to the point where their heartbeat was slow enough he could actually observe the individual contractions of atria and ventricles. Because if you can imagine looking at a heartbeat, it's really tough to figure out what's going on. There's no chance of taking videotape and slowing it down. It's all naked eye observation. So it's a pretty clever way to get about it. So that sets us up for the early, well, we're basically through the Renaissance now, and we've got a foundation on what medical theory was and how the Galenic and Hippocratic ideas had kind of fallen into disrepute. And next time we're going to go back and look at how disease was conceptualized and how that concept changed as a result of the Galenic theories being doubted and eventually surpassed. And any questions? So next talk will be on the first. Going once, going twice. Let's give it up for Atlas Club and Office for Student Life one more time. And just in case anybody missed it, make sure you sign in on the computer on that table over there so you get credit for being here. And it's been a pleasure. Thanks, everybody.